The gross domestic product, GDP, has been used as the gold standard of economics for almost a century. Is it still useful, or has it become a thing of the past? GDP is the most widely accepted economic indicator used to measure a country's health, followed by measures of unemployment, productivity, and inflation. The mathematical calculation of GDP considers all consumer spending, government spending, private investments, and net exports minus net imports. This calculation provides an approximation of the national income of a given country. Increases in production, productivity, and consumption grow the GDP. In 2023, the United States GDP was $27.36 trillion, the largest in the world. Simon Kuznets, an economist from the National Bureau of Economic Research, invented the concepts of the gross domestic product and the gross national product to measure national income during the harsh economic landscape of the Great Depression. After its invention in the 1930s, GDP quickly took over the economic indicator landscape. Interestingly, in his 1934 letter to the U.S. Senate, Kuznets warned about the potential abuses of the metric, stating that, quote, "the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income." While mainstream economists and politicians often attempt to measure human welfare by looking at GDP, the use of GDP as the principal economic indicator in the USA misrepresents the human well-being of the public because it fails to account for the environmental and social costs of economic growth, such as pollution, resource depletion, and income inequality. Human well-being refers to the standard of living within an economy. It implies that humans have a sustainable way of meeting their basic needs so that they can prosper. GDP is often used as an oversimplification to measure the human well-being and prosperity of the American public. However, measuring human well-being, also known as economic, social, and human welfare, is considerably more complicated. To create a more comprehensive indicator of well-being and economic prosperity, some economists have invented alternative metrics. The United Nations invented the Human Development Index in 1990. Economists Clifford Cobb, Ted Halstead, and Jonathan Rowe created the Genuine Progress Indicator in 1995, and the New Economics Foundation created the Happy Planet Index in 2006. Ultimately, this video essay will analyze the extent to which the use of GDP as the principal economic indicator in the United States accurately measures the human well-being of the public. First, it will consider the strengths of the GDP. Next, it will examine the GDP's failure to account for environmental and social costs in its calculation. And finally, the alternatives section of this paper will explore several indicators and their potential as large-scale alternatives to the gross domestic product. Part 1. Strengths of the gross domestic product. No metric can perfectly measure economic welfare. The gross domestic product is no exception. However, despite its major flaws, it retains global significance. While GDP growth goals for high-income countries with low GDP growth rates are often inefficient and pointless, there are undeniable benefits to low-income countries with high GDP growth rates seeking further economic growth. Kate Raworth states in her book, Donut Economics, that, quote, across low and middle income countries, a higher GDP tends to go hand in hand with greatly increased life expectancy at birth, far fewer children dying before the age of 5, and many more children going to school. She reminds the reader that, quote, 80% of the world's population live in such countries. In the early stages of a country's development, pursuing GDP growth objectively benefits that country's well-being. The founder of GDP, Simon Kuznets, developed the measure of national income to shed light on the state of the economy during the Great Depression, to provide a mathematical analysis of the specific sectors of the economy that might be holding back growth. As a result, the GDP equation can give insight into the best ways to grow a young or struggling economy. To this day, more than 90 years after the introduction of the GDP, it is still used at the highest levels of the American government and around the world. In an interview I had with William A. Ramos, he stated, quote, GDP is the gold standard of calculating economic development of countries all around the world. As the presidentially appointed senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Economic Development, Mr. Ramos holds considerable sway in the Economic Development Administration. His pro-GDP school of thought, made clear as he repeated multiple times GDP is the gold standard, is shared among many of the government's top economic offices. At first glance, GDP growth correlates with welfare benefits that outweigh the flaws of the metric. However, when such a metric carries so much power in politics and international relations, it is imperative that the metric accurately represents economic health. The economy is a massive and complex system, and to measure its health, a metric like GDP must consider every aspect of the economy. What happens if it leaves hundreds of billions of dollars in costs out of the calculation? What happens when the distribution of the national income is left out of the GDP? According to Mr. Ramos, quote, you have to be able to calculate the economy, and you can't include everything in that bucket. Some things have got to stay out. The next two sections will examine the environmental and social cost of growth. An environmental cost of economic growth refers to the negative impacts on the environment that result from increased production and consumption. For example, iPhone production results in the depletion of finite natural resources such as lithium and gold. Environmental degradation is intrinsically linked to economic growth, and no economy has grown with zero environmental costs. However, the cost of environmental degradation is completely excluded from the GDP. Environmental costs such as pollution and resource depletion are not only detrimental to the sustainability of economic growth and human well-being, but they also add up to significant dollar amounts that would have a consequential impact on the United States GDP. So how much money is actually being left out of the GDP calculation? Is that figure large enough to significantly impact the GDP? One of the most significant environmental costs of production is pollution. Pollution is a byproduct of almost all economic activity. The oil and gas industry, for example, is the leading contributor to air pollution and one of the biggest contributing industries to the US GDP. It creates $5.3 trillion of economic activity while pumping 5.1 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere every year. Agriculture is another significant contributor to the US GDP. It is responsible for 1% of the US national income, and it emits 10% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. These are just two of the many sources of pollution within the US economy that contribute to the global greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is a global phenomenon where greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane create layers in the Earth's atmosphere that trap the sun's heat and slowly warm the planet. 2 degrees Celsius of planetary warming is a critical threshold. Above 2 degrees Celsius of warming, dangerous and cascading effects of human-generated climate change, such as more extreme weather events, will occur. The 2017 U.S. Climate Science Report estimates a global temperature increase of at least 2.8 degrees Celsius by 2100 at the current rate of global greenhouse gas emissions. The economic consequences of the greenhouse effect and the resulting extreme weather events are monumental. A 2023 study in the peer-reviewed Nature Communications journal statistically analyzed the cost of extreme weather events attributable to climate change. The study aggregates direct economic costs such as revenue loss from supply chain disruptions and temporary unemployment in areas affected by storms, fires, floods, or other climate change-induced natural disasters. It estimates the cost of property damage and loss of human life directly attributable to climate change disasters. The study concludes that human-caused global warming and the subsequent extreme weather events cost the global economy approximately $260.8 billion every year. Dividing this sum by the 2023 global GDP of $105.4 trillion reveals that extreme weather events would account for approximately 0.25% of the global GDP. Nonetheless, the gross domestic product fails to reflect this considerable economic cost. While there are some federal regulations of pollution, the United States does not have legislation such as a carbon tax that would account for the immense economic cost of companies and individuals contributing to global warming and pollution. As a result, a large portion of the cost of pollution and the resulting global warming and the extreme weather events are left unaccounted for in the GDP metric. This begs the question, how can the gross domestic product be the gold standard of economics while excluding over $250 billion from its calculation? Well, the Nature Communications study provides a valuable estimate of the contemporary costs of extreme weather events caused by anthropogenic climate change. It doesn't predict the future. On the other hand, the United States Geological Survey states that, quote, with increasing global surface temperatures, the possibility of more droughts and increased intensity storms will likely occur. Furthermore, according to the En-ROADS climate simulation, large portions of the densely populated American East Coast will be flooded by rising sea levels by 2050. The economic costs of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions are so significant that excluding them from the GDP calculation means sacrificing the accuracy of the metric. This paper will not attempt to predict the future either. However, as extreme weather events caused by climate change intensify and billions of dollars of property are lost to rising sea levels in the next 30 years, the world's leading economic indicator must take the environmental costs of economic growth into account and accurately represent the well-being of the public. Natural resource depletion. From burning coal for electricity to cutting down forests for wood and paper, economic growth relies on the use of natural resources. While the exploitation of natural resources is not always detrimental to the environment, when done unsustainably, it threatens the future of GDP growth and the standard of living of the American public. Neither the value of a country's natural resources nor the full extent of the cost of depleting resource reserves are included in the GDP calculation. Some economists argue that the supply and demand relationship regulates the cost of extracting non-renewable resources such as minerals and oil. They argue that as non-renewables become more scarce, the market price will increase, thus the cost of using these irreplaceable resources will be reflected in the gross domestic product. However, data from a 300-year study of the relationship between extraction and inflation-adjusted prices of 65 non-renewable resources indicates that the extraction has increased 600-fold since 1700, while the prices of most non-renewables have remained almost stagnant. Therefore, the cost of extracting irreplaceable natural resources remains unrepresented by the so-called all-inclusive gross domestic product. Since the economy's current dependence on resource consumption for growth is unsustainable, many economists promote economic decoupling. Economic decoupling is the separation of economic growth from its dependence on natural resource consumption. Decoupling would make GDP growth possible while relieving immense pressure on the environment. However, decoupling still wouldn't account for billions of dollars of environmental costs that pollution from every U.S. economic sector generates. If the United States is to continue chasing economic growth under the illusion that it will improve the well-being of the public, the gross domestic product must be redefined to account for the monumental environmental costs addressed above. Furthermore, the decoupling of economic growth from unsustainable resource consumption must become a reality. Social costs of growth. The most common critique of the gross domestic product is its failure to represent the distribution of national income. Often, economists use GDP per capita, calculated by dividing GDP by the total population, to estimate average individual income and standard of living. However, both GDP and GDP per capita are easily skewed by lofty earnings in economic sectors that only benefit a wealthy minority of the population. As a result, strong economies with flourishing GDP growth rates often accompany unwieldy income gaps between the rich and the poor. This leads to costly issues such as social unrest, tension between the rich and poor, increased crime rates, and disparities in education and healthcare. How can an all-encompassing measure of economic well-being, such as the gross domestic product, grow while the majority of the public suffers declining standards of living? In 2022, the US GDP per capita was $77,248. However, this number does not reflect how evenly income is distributed among the population. In fact, according to the US Census data, the 2022 median household income was less than the 2022 GDP per capita by more than $2,000. This means that more than half of American households make less money than the average American's individual income. For example, if the richest American, Elon Musk's, income increases, the GDP per capita will increase without any increase in the general public well-being. The gross domestic product fails to measure the authentic American standard of living by ignoring the rampant income inequality in the United States. Not only does the gross domestic product exclude income inequality from its calculation, but it also exacerbates the problem by misinforming decision makers. According to the Congressional Research Service, politicians pursuing GDP growth will often implement expansionary policies. Expansionary policy aims to stimulate aggregate demand, often by lending money directly to businesses. This policy can unfairly favor influential industries and unintentionally widen the income inequality gap by focusing solely on economic growth in the sectors of the economy that have a limited impact on the large-scale well-being of the public. Alternatives. The fundamental shortcomings outlined above prove that the gross domestic product no longer accurately represents the well-being of the American public. While the GDP may have been an effective measure in lifting the U.S. out of the Great Depression, it is no longer an adequate measure of American economic well-being in light of the multifaceted challenges of the 21st century. Is any part of the GDP worth using? Are there alternatives that provide a more accurate gauge of economic welfare? Could these alternatives replace the role of the GDP? Two of the most prominent alternatives to the GDP are the Happy Planet Index and the Genuine Progress Indicator. Both metrics strive to provide a more holistic indicator of economic well-being. The Happy Planet Index considers average life expectancy, self-reported well-being, and per capita carbon footprint. This calculation theoretically allows for a deeper analysis of the environmental impact and well-being of a given country. However, it has three critical flaws. The HPI favors the use of a carbon footprint metric rather than a more encompassing measure of environmental impact. It relies on subjective self-reported measures of well-being, and it doesn't consider national income, not to mention income inequality. It is more of a social metric than an economic indicator. A more promising alternative is the Genuine Progress Indicator, which aggregates personal consumption adjusted for income distribution, capital growth, and the value of housework, parenting, and volunteering before subtracting the costs of crime, auto accidents, consumer durables, various forms of economic degradation, and the value of time. The GPI makes a noble effort to address each shortcoming of the GDP. However, in the 30 years since its invention, it has never come close to replacing the GDP. This is largely due to the broad definition of the genuine progress indicator and the subjectivity of certain aspects such as the value of time that makes it hard to objectively compare GPI values for different countries. On the other hand, the GPI is a remarkable feat of applied econometrics that addresses environmental and social costs that are excluded from the GDP calculation. While both HPI and GPI have critical flaws that have impeded them from sweeping control of the economic indicator landscape, they represent the kind of economic thinking that will foster long-term growth of human well-being and the economy. The issue with GDP is that crucial aspects of economic welfare are excluded from its calculation, and the accuracy of the metric is lost. Acknowledging the value of the GDP equation, however, allows economists to strategically supplement certain aspects of the equation to incorporate crucial costs. This is the methodology behind the Integrated Economic and Environmental Satellite Accounts, IEESA, developed by the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. Instead of attempting to replace the GDP completely like the GPI or HPI, the Integrated Economic and Environmental Satellite Accounts are designed to complement a measure of GDP and address environmental costs of growth. The IEE satellite accounts aim to quantify, quote, natural and environmental assets as a part of the nation's wealth and highlight the interaction between the economy and its natural environment. The IEESAs consider pollution, for example, air and water, developed natural resources, for example, cultivated land and extracted oil, and non-produced environmental assets, for example, undiscovered natural gas deposits. The IEESAs would be incredibly valuable supplements to the GDP. However, further refinement and implementation of the satellite accounts has been significantly delayed as a result of congressional budget cuts. While the IEESAs effectively consider environmental factors, their main shortcoming is the continued exclusion of social costs. The Human Development Index is arguably the most refined, well-structured, and thoroughly researched economic well-being indicator. The metric was introduced by the United Nations in 1990. The calculation of HDI is a geometric average of the gross national income, also known as GNI, a similar metric to GDP, life expectancy, and education indices. It effectively combines standard indicators of well-being with a national income measurement to create an alternative to GDP that more holistically considers human welfare. As a result of its reliable methodology, it has been more widely recognized than other GDP alternatives. Unfortunately, the HDI is no better than the GDP at incorporating environmental factors into its calculation. The limitations of the gross domestic product are well known, and welfare economists have been searching for a more encompassing measure of well-being for decades. Powerful organizations such as the United Nations, the U.S. Department of Commerce, and independent economic think tanks have developed alternative metrics to address specific shortcomings of GDP. However, they have yet to fully encompass the scope of economic well-being in a single metric. As a result, the gross domestic product continues to be used as the gold standard around the world. Perhaps the solution to the GDP problem lies in a synthesis of IEESAs with the gross national income factor in the HDI equation. Or perhaps a refined version of the genuine progress indicator will take over the economic indicator landscape. Through this investigation, it has become clear that the power of a gold standard economic metric is monumental. Legislation is often passed with the goal of growing the gross domestic product because policymakers assume that it is an accurate measure of welfare and it creates an easy statistical bragging point. That is not a bad or broken system. In fact, politicians should brag about improving human welfare. However, the system does not function as efficiently as it could. It is like filling a bucket of human welfare from a leaky faucet. Too much of the water is wasted due to systemic inefficiencies. Kuznets, GDP's founder, stated in 1962 that, quote, goals for more growth should specify more growth of what and for what. If the goal of filling the bucket of human welfare isn't articulated, then the leaky faucet can go unnoticed. But what if the bucket of human welfare was intentionally filled from a working faucet? That is the power of a functional, well-founded, and all-inclusive measure of national income. Thank you.